Stories change with time and interest. Even fantasy stories set in the imagination of the author. In this day and age, it has become more and more popular to have stories about space, to have fantastical tales set in the far future, tales that still incorporate the elements of fantasy rather than that of hard science fiction. But how do you world build for such worlds? How do you incorporate some elements of science and blend it with magic? Where do you draw the line between this is possible and this purely fantastical? That is what I want to explore in this series of videos about world building for science fantasy worlds. Welcome to Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you like what I do here, if you like science fantasy world building, you may very well like my book, Magic Fall, that I wrote with my podcast partner, Drake. This is a science fantasy coming-of-age novel which has a magic system, it has flying cats, it has a flying city, and all the other elements that you would expect from a science fantasy novel. And my podcast partner and I did a whole series of podcasts about plotting the novel and doing the world building involved in it. So if you're interested in seeing behind the scenes on how such novels are crafted, pick up a copy of Magic Fall and check out the podcast, all on the Magic Fall website linked below. And of course, every purchase supports the channel. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about what science fantasy world building is and what I am going to explore during this series of videos. So what is science fantasy and how does world building for it differ from our traditional fantasy world building? So the first thing that you have to think about here is how much vaster space is than the normal worlds that we build. Space can potentially be a world every week, the way that they built it in Stargate. You can have races that have developed life that aren't even related to how our life developed at all. It could be silicon-based races. Unlikely, but it could be. It could be races based, you could have species based on hydrogen. You could have whole worlds built in entirely different ways from how we world build in our fantasy worlds. And because of this very different aspect, your world building can suck you in, and it can create a situation where you're just building so much that you never get to the story part. And so it's very important to talk about science fantasy world building and space fantasy world building in a slightly different way from how we would approach fantastical world building. You have to think about elements like the vastness of distances, the myriad planets, and the wide variety of completely undiscovered elements. Also, you have to consider not only the evolution of different planets, but also how space travel would affect people differently. What would happen with humans who, now start traveling in space? How would that change our societies, our cultures, our approach to life? Also, what would happen with the political dynamics? In a fantasy world, you can take a look back at our historical examples and you can say, okay, so basically governments kind of infect each other. We went through a period of god kings, then we went through a period of democracies with qualified vote, then there was some collapses, maybe we went back to feudalism, maybe we turned instead to a approach of hierarchy, the way the Chinese did, and with a meritocracy with the Confucius exams and so on. But if you are looking at science fantasy, your governments both in type and in proliferation vastly expand. After all, people can take their governments with them. Their governments can change in space. The environment around them can dramatically alter. And all of this creates a very new setup for your space fantasy environment, where you could travel from a planet that's ruled by a monarchy to a planet that has a plethora of governments that all work together based on treaty, the way the European Union does, or one of those equivalent governments. So while you still have the basic government types, and if you want my view on government types, check out the information card. So all of this makes for a very different world building approach. And then, of course, there is the actual science part of this equation. And that brings us from science fantasy to science fiction. And what is the difference? So one of the most daunting aspects, or at least one of the aspects that I found the most daunting when I approached this world building in Magic Fall, is the actual science part. Now, I am not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. I studied mathematics at university and I work as a computer programmer. And I have some background in history and economics. But science, physics, chemistry, and so on is not my best thing. And that brings me to don't feel too intimidated by this. There are two flavors of science fiction. The hard side focuses on scientific accuracy and logic. It tries to use real and theoretical physics to build an environment that people can believe is scientifically accurate and that the characters then interact with in a scientific manner. This includes films like Interstellar or novels like The Martian. Although I will say that even for authors who write in science fiction, there are always those who dispute whether that science is actually real and would actually work. Now, that is not the kind of world building I am going to cover in this series. I do not have that kind of knowledge. It's not a genre I'm particularly interested in. I generally don't even read much hard science fiction. So, this series is going to focus on the softer side of science fiction, on the science fantasy or space fantasy genre. This kind of world building leans heavily into speculative science or into even fantastical elements like some kind of magic system, etc. An example of this, of course, famously is Star Wars. In the same category, I would count Stargate SG-1 and the movies and Stargate Atlantis. I would also include in here Doctor Who and Babylon 5. From a book perspective, Dune falls firmly in this category for me, into the science fantasy category, as does the Warhammer 40k universe with its novels and the role-playing games and everything else set in that universe. And I will delve more into those examples because that is where I will heavily be drawing from during the rest of this series. But first, let's just talk about the pros and cons about science fiction, hard science fiction, versus the soft side. Hard science fiction can absolutely be rewarding, and there are, of course, novels that do a great job of this. There are indeed books that do very well in the genre. But it does require more research. It does require you to be as accurate and as close to actual science as possible, and to explore beyond science using what would logically follow from science that we know today. Soft science fiction, on the other hand, allows for much more creativity. You can introduce random elements, you can use theories which are very theoretical and out there to build your world on. But bear in mind that, like with fantasy, you do run the risk of straying beyond the bounds of believability, straining your readers and throwing them out of the world if you don't bring it back to ground it somewhat in science. And that, of course, is the difference between science fantasy and pure fantasy, where in pure fantasy, readers are much more willing to believe in dragons and magic and random stuff like that. In science fantasy, they do want it to be more grounded and to have that element of believability. And if this series excites you, do make sure to hit the thumbs up button and let me know in the comments below what you would like to see in this series going forward. And now I want to talk about the reference material that I will draw on and the topics that I wish to explore in the rest of this series. One of the most famous intellectual properties involving science fantasy is certainly the Star Wars saga. There is no doubt that this is one of the biggest science fantasy properties. And of course, I will draw extensively on Star Wars. For Star Wars, I will be focusing on the whole suite of the IP from the original movies right through to the Yuzong War and all of those books that have subsequently been declared legends. And I will draw also from the later movies and the prequels. My focus with these movies will be on how a rebellion in space would work, so the rise of the Empire and the rebellion against it, and why the Old Republic fell, and how the Old Republic politics worked, that kind of federal government in a very distributed, vastly different, galaxy-wide model. I will also be drawing, of course, on the fantastical elements of Star Wars, specifically on the Force, how it works, the dictamony between the Jedi and the Sith, and how that relationship impacts the stories told in that world. But Star Wars isn't the only series set in space. Babylon 5 will be another series that I will draw extensively from. Now, my aim with Babylon 5 is somewhat different from Star Wars. For those of you who don't know what Babylon 5 is, it's a 90s TV series that was set on a space station that's drifting in space with like different races cooperating to kind of work out their differences and prevent war, a neutral ground. And that is one of the things we will focus on in drawing from Babylon 5 is the exploration of certain neutral zones in space, creating spaces where the different species from different planets can collaborate and discuss different differences between them, and where they can reach a point of consensus rather than launching into war. We will also discuss when diplomacy fails and the wars that result. We will discuss telepathy, as that is a large element of the Babylon 5 world building. And in Babylon 5, we will discuss the concept of older races and how they can be used in science fantasy world building, and what it means that you have races at different points in their technological journey and how they interact with each other. Babylon 5 does a great job of illustrating this with the Vorlon and the Shadows and the First Ones and so on, and all the impacts that they have on the story. And then, of course, from a book perspective, it would absolutely be remiss of me not to include Dune. So we will be looking at Dune as well in this series. For Dune, I plan to look at the power dynamics around a single resource, the spice melange, and how a feudal system in space would work. How you can blend the concept of noble houses into a setting as advanced in space and still have it work, as well as how you can take religion and amalgamate it into a single religion for the world, the way that Dune did with the Orange Catholic Bible. And speaking of religion, as I said, I will include the Warhammer 40k, the grim, dark future where there is only war universe, in drawing on examples of science fantasy world building. For Warhammer 40k, I will be drawing on religion and its impact in science fantasy, as well as on the effect of continuous war and what it does to a society in a science fantasy setting, how it impacts culture and behavior to have a galaxy in conflict on an almost continuous basis. And then, of course, I will be drawing from my own book, from Magic Fall, and I will be exploring in that book how to approach things like a post-apocalyptic environment, which is what we built in our world in Magic Fall. It is a post-apocalyptic environment, how to create apocalypses in space, what it means for a society if there is an apocalypse, how people flee it, how they rebuild on another planet, and so forth. I will also, using my book, explore using technology as magic, using actual magic, and using science as the basis for a magic system. In my own book, again, I will also be exploring evolutionary topics and how you can use evolution to populate a world with strange and fantastical creatures that still feel as though they are related to everything else in the world around them. There will, of course, be other sources of information as well. I will be drawing from Doctor Who and from Star Trek and from Stargate, SG-1, Atlantis, the movies, even Universe, because these are all science fantasy IPs that I like very much. So they are IPs that I will be drawing on for this series. If you can think of another IP that I should be drawing on, let me know in the comments below, and I will see if I either know it or if I can get hold of it in order to learn what I can from the world building they do there. This series is going to be a deep dive into a lot of topics. You can expect to see geopolitical tensions and governments, trade and commerce, building fantastical elements into your science fantasy worlds, space piracy and security, and how to protect both your planet and your vessels as they travel through space. We'll talk about space warfare versus on-planet warfare and how that impacts building your military forces. And of course, we will talk about cultures, societies, and how to build them. So, if you like this series, hit the thumbs up button. Let me know in the comments below what you would like to see from this science fantasy world building series. And if you're interested in these kinds of topics where technology comes into play, maybe check out my video on setting a technology level for a fantasy world. It really does help the channel if you click on these videos and watch 2 in a row. It lets YouTube know that my channel is well loved. So if you could do that, I would very much appreciate it.